In 1908, a young mother in New York attached a wire mesh box to the outside of her back window. She wanted her newborn daughter to nap in fresh air, the way her doctor had recommended. Within days, neighbors heard the baby crying and threatened to report her to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. That mother was Eleanor Roosevelt, and her daughter Anna was, by most accounts, one of the first babies raised with a window-mounted fresh air box, years before the idea had a name, let alone a patent. Roosevelt later wrote that she was genuinely baffled by the neighbors' outrage. She thought she was simply being a modern, well-informed mother. The instinct behind it wasn't cruelty, it was fear. Tuberculosis was one of the deadliest diseases in industrial cities, and doctors were convinced, correctly in part, that fresh air and sunlight helped fight it. Whole institutions sprang up around the idea. Open-air schools with windows flung open in winter, sanatoriums built on breezy hillsides, children bundled in blankets and marched outdoors to nap on cots regardless of season. For families in cramped tenement apartments, with no yard and no balcony, there was nowhere for a baby to get that fresh air except out the window itself. In 1922, an inventor named Emma Red of Spokane, Washington, filed a patent that turned this vague idea into an actual product. Her design, U.S. Patent 48235, was a collapsible wire cage that bolted to the exterior sill of an apartment window. A grid of narrow beams gave it rigidity. A sloped tin roof kept out rain and snow, and heavy wire mesh, mostly open, let air and light through while, in theory, keeping the baby from falling out. Reed's patent application is almost touchingly earnest about the problem. Crowded cities, she wrote, left babies and young children with no way to get proper fresh air, and this device was meant to fix that, section by section, bolt by bolt. She wasn't even the first to try. A few years earlier, a Mrs. Robert C. Lafferty had already advertised a similar wire enclosure under the name Health Cage, aimed at exactly the same market of apartment-bound parents. The idea crossed the Atlantic and found its biggest audience in London in the 1930s. Housing there was just as cramped, gardens just as rare, and the fresh air gospel just as strong. The Chelsea Baby Club, a neighborhood welfare initiative, began distributing baby cages to mothers who had no garden of their own, hanging them from the outside of upper-story windows across the borough. The idea caught on widely enough that in 1935 the Royal Institute of British Architects singled out the window-mounted baby cage as an element worth including in new middle-class housing design, citing Chelsea's program directly as a model to follow. For a design nobody today would let near a building code, it briefly had the endorsement of the architectural establishment. For a few years, this was simply how modern, health-conscious parents did things. Newspapers ran cheerful photography of infants dozing in mid-air, wrapped in blankets, several stories above the pavement, with nothing between them and the street but a few inches of wire mesh. There were no safety inspections, no weight ratings, no age minimums. A cage was sold or given away by a charity, and a father or mother bolted it to a window frame using whatever brackets came in the box, trusting the design and, mostly, their own city's total absence of building codes for the product. The Second World War effectively ended the practice in Britain. During the Blitz, a wire cage hanging off the side of a bombed or badly damaged building was obviously not where anyone wanted an infant sleeping, and the whole culture of leaving a baby outside, unsupervised, took on a very different meaning under nightly air raids. Baby cages did resurface briefly around 1953, in a smaller and more cautious wave, but they never regained their earlier popularity, and the post-war building boom left little room for a product built for a very specific, very cramped kind of housing. By the mid-20th century, The fresh air cage had quietly disappeared from both sides of the Atlantic. Pediatric advice shifted indoors, toward controlled nurseries, regulated temperatures, and eventually car seats and monitored cribs. Rising car ownership also meant city streets, once mostly foot and horse traffic below those windows, now carried exhaust and the real danger of things falling and being dropped farther than anyone wanted to test. Safety concerns that seem obvious today, a rusted bracket, a curious toddler leaning against the mesh, a storm-loosened bolt, apparently mattered less than the fear of tuberculosis at the time the cages were popular, and mattered a great deal more once that fear had faded. Decades later, magazines would rank the baby cage alongside radium toothpaste and lead paint toys on lists of history's worst inventions, treating it as a punchline rather than what it actually was. A sincere, patented, charity-distributed answer to a genuine public health crisis. Nothing about the baby cage was reckless by the standards of the people who used it. It was patented, publicly distributed by a respected charity, and endorsed by architects designing new housing. It solved a real problem: fresh air for infants in cities with no green space, using the only exterior surface most tenement families had, the outside of a window. It also happened to hang a sleeping baby several stories above a city sidewalk, held up by hardware nobody today would trust with a flower box. Would you have trusted a cage bolted to your window ledge? Follow for the next object.